Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our first webinar of 2023 for the London branch. We did have an event in January, which was, again, limited numbers of attendees, but thank you very much to TfL and Renuka, one of our committee members who organised that. As I said, because of the nature of the event, we couldn't have too many people attending, but all those that did go seemed to thoroughly enjoy it. But our first webinar, it's a great pleasure to introduce Rosie Russell, who's another committee member on our London branch, who's going to talk to us today about personal resilience, stress and mental health. So I'm going to immediately hand over to you, Rosie.
Thank you very much, Greg. So there's a few things I'd like to cover over the next 40 minutes or so. First of all, a wee bit of background about mental health, but also I'd like to take a look at stress and what it is. I'd like to talk about the cognitive behavioural model and then a model of personal resilience, and then I'll be quite happy to take questions at the end. But this really is my starting point, is that we all have mental health. Mental health as a phrase has this negative connotation, yet it actually it just refers to how we think, feel, behave and interact with other people. It's not positive, it's not negative. We have mental health in the same way that we have physical health. Now, hopefully you'll be able to hear this. It's a short video. This was published by the HSE back in 2002 as part of their launch of the stress management standards. And Tony's going to talk a little bit about his experience with depression.
The worst thing about depression is that when you're in it, it's hard to recognise. I'm going to take me. I'm a fireman. And over time, the normal day-to-day pressure work just got to be too much.
Oh.
Just before I went off, a new boss started at work and we didn't really get on. And when I complained about being under pressure, he told me just to get on with things. So I tried, but I found myself unable to cope. And then one day at the station, for no apparent reason, I started crying. My boss suggested I go and see my GP. You know, I didn't even realise it was depression until my GP diagnosed it. I thought I was just a bit down. I mean, firemen aren't supposed to get depressed, are they? On my GP's advice, I was signed off with depression. I didn't want anyone at work knowing I had depression. I mean, the guys at work didn't know what to do, so they just kind of stayed away. I think that I found it easier if I'd have had, I don't know, a heart attack or something. Most days I didn't want to get out of bed, honestly. The main reason I got out of bed was because the dog needed walking and my wife had to go to work. So I'd get up, walk the dog, take her to work and come back. Some days I'd go back to bed. Some days I'd just sit on the couch and wonder what I was going to do next. I was unable to talk in a normal way to friends and family about anything, let alone how awful I was feeling. It's a cliche, but it was like a black cloud was following me around. Anyway, I do feel better now. I've had treatment, which is ongoing, and I've been easier on myself. There are a lot of people who've been in the same situation. I found out that 1 in 10 people are depressed at any one time. It's nice to know that I'm not alone. I'm not the only one. Anyway, I've gone back to work now in reduced hours in the short term, and I've had some really useful conversations with my boss regarding demands at work. And you know what? It's really surprised me how understanding he's been. But I found out that his wife's had depression too, so he's been able to understand to a certain degree just how it can impact on you.
I think the thing that Tony underlines here really is that he didn't talk about a cause as to why he was feeling like this. In fact, there doesn't need to be a cause. people who suffer from stress and depression, it is very personal as to what's going on there, and what stress is or causes a problem for us might not for somebody else. The other thing is, Tony talks there about treatment. And actually, the great news when we're talking about mental ill health is that the vast majority of people who suffer from mental ill health recover fully and live their lives to the full. But mental health costs every economy. And back in 2017, the government of the day commissioned the Stevenson-Fellmer report. They wanted to take a look at what was mental health costing the UK economy. And they came up with some, to be quite frank, quite shocking figures of 74 to 99 billion pounds per annum. Now, this was underpinned by a piece of work by Deloitte, and both reports are still out there if you want to go and read them. But effectively, this is costing the economy and employers between about 1,700 up to about probably 2,300–400 pounds in today's prices per person of working age. If we also take a look at the Health and Safety Executive statistics for work-related stress, anxiety and depression, we find it is the top cause of occupational ill health and absence. 51% of all occupational ill health cases, and that's up 33% in the last 3 years. Probably no surprise post-COVID. It's 46% of all working days lost due to both accidents and ill health at work. So for me as a risk management and health and safety professional, this to me should almost be our #1 target for improving the mental health of people at work. And the statistics, they are useful. They underline actually how much of a problem we're trying to tackle here. But they miss the moral cost and personal impact on an individual. Now, globally, there are 1 in 6 people currently suffering from a mental health condition. Half of those will be suffering with a severe mental health condition. Now, here I'd like to challenge people's perspective or perception on people with a mental health condition, an ill health condition. An awful lot of those with a current mental health condition can actually be working and living a normal life with appropriate support, whether that be talking therapies, antidepressants, many other treatments as well. So people you know will have mental health conditions. Now, I want to introduce you to the mental health pain scale. This was first published on the internet by someone who goes by the tag The Graceful Patient. And it's a very useful insight into what's going on inside the head of someone going through mental ill health. Because for many of us, we'll have no point of reference. And up at the top, we are looking at the normal range of human existence. From walking down the street, singing a song, or, as it says here, cuddling a fluffy kitten, everything is fine. But we all know it's not like that every day or all day. And sometimes we're a bit frustrated or disappointed. But you're probably easily distracted and cheered up with a little effort. Maybe a colleague drops by and says, "Do you fancy a cup of tea?" And that's probably all it takes to actually lift you back into quite a positive frame of mind. But we've also all had days at 3. Things are bothering you. You're coping. You're still getting up and going to work and doing everything you need to do. You might just be overtired or maybe hungry. It is the emotional equivalent of a headache. A little bit of self-care you're going to be fine. Now, we move now into the moderate area. At 4, this wouldn't necessarily still be mental ill health. It's a bad day or maybe a few bad days. But you've got the skills to get through it, and perhaps, friends being around, some self-care strategies. It might just be something as simple as saying, no, I'm not going out this evening. I'm going to have a nice bath and an early night. And that might be all that's needed. But if we carry on down this line, we'll end up at 5. And this is the point when your mental health is starting to impact on your everyday life. Things are starting to become hard. Now, you are probably outwardly still coping. You are still going to work, getting the kids to school, cooking dinner, doing the laundry. But it probably feels like you're walking through treacle or mud. And this is the point at which you should be speaking to your doctor. This isn't just a few days. This is now probably a few weeks, and things aren't getting easier. The problem is an awful lot of people at this point are starting to feel maybe helpless, somewhat worthless, and a lot of them will not go and talk to the doctor. So they'll end up at 6. Now here, you can't do things the way you usually do due to your mental health. There's a lot of noise going on in your head. Impulsive, compulsive thoughts. You're ruminating over things. Life is now actually starting to get really quite hard. And at 7, we are now into the more severe end of mental distress. You're avoiding things that make you more distressed. Problem is that's going to make it worse. So you might be avoiding social situations where actually you might recharge from being around your friends. You are avoiding things like opening the mail because you're convincing yourself there's going to be bad news in there. This is actually quite serious, and you definitely need help now. At 8, though, you can't hide your struggles anymore. Your friends and family are now noticing because you're having issues with sleeping, eating, having fun, socializing, working, studying. Your mental health is affecting almost all parts of your life. And we've all met this person. But what's interesting, I find, about this scale is that they needed help at 5. And if we are noticing, they are now probably at 8. So this is where you start to ask the question, well, why doesn't that person reach out for help? And the simple answer is they can't. They don't feel worth it. They don't feel that anybody would respond. So when we find a friend or a colleague or a member of the family that is obviously struggling, it's actually incumbent on us to reach in. And reaching in is far more powerful. Because if we don't, someone who's at 8 stands a chance of going down to 9. And this is someone who really needs urgent help, who might be a risk to themselves or others if left untreated. And at 10, this is where you should be sitting with somebody and phoning the local crisis line. Or if they're in immediate danger to themselves, calling the police, who have the powers under the Mental Health Act. So this, for me, is a very useful resource to actually communicate where somebody is. And it is worth remembering that the degree of distress is personal. You don't need to have it worse than others to be in distress. Because if you can't be distressed because somebody else has it worse than you, it's like saying you can't be happy because someone else has it better than you. Of course you can be distressed. But the good news is the vast majority of people get help and the vast majority of people do get better. Now, from an occupational point of view, stress is something that we should all be aware of. After all, it was 2002 when the Health and Safety Executive first published the stress management standards. They've been revised and updated since then, but the HSE publishes a lot of tools in support of this. And I quite often get asked, well, what is stress? Well, fundamentally, it's an imbalance between the resources you've got and the resources you're being expected to expend. There's just simply not enough in the tank, and you're trying to do more. People say, oh, well, surely being a bit stressed is good because it gets you to do things. No. This is where we get to the third question there, the difference between stress and pressure. Stress is when pressure has become too much. A bit of pressure is great. That motivates us. That gets us up in the morning, gets us to work on time, gets the presentation done, gets the report submitted to your boss. Pressure's good. Too much pressure, though, results in stress. And stress is fundamentally the individual's reaction to an imbalance between the demands and pressures placed on them and their personal ability to cope with those demands. And it's interesting because the literature finds that the reaction is intensified if the perceived consequences of failure are severe. Think of that student cramming overnight to try and get all that knowledge into their brain for an exam, or the doctor that cannot walk away from their rounds to get the break they so desperately need because they are too worried about failing their patients. The reality is with people like that, where that perceived consequence of failure is severe, is they just carry on at the point they should stop and they'll end up breaking. So what is it that stresses you? I certainly know what it is that stresses me, but what does it look like or feel like to you? I mean, I know I get that feeling in the pit of the stomach. If it's quite bad, I kind of get a bit of a metallic taste. That's adrenaline. But to other people, it probably doesn't look like anything at all. I most of the time look fairly calm and collected. That's my fairly natural state. But I can be churning inside. And this is the problem, is that we don't realize that somebody sitting next to us is highly stressed. Now, in the workplace, there are a number of different sources of stress, and we call them stressors. The first one is demands. We can see that if we actually just have too much to do, that can become stressful. But it turns out if we have a high degree of control over what we do, how we do it, when we deliver things, we can actually cope with a lot more demands. So control balances demands very strongly, as does support. If you've got good support from both your peers and your manager, you will cope with more demands. But if you feel like you're flying solo and you've got no peer support, or perhaps you're seeing other people being supported and you're not, that can actually become a negative. Same with relationships. If you're working in a good supportive environment where the relationships between your colleagues is cooperative and collaborative, where you've got a good rapport with your manager, all of this is going to help us deliver more. But it only takes one toxic relationship or one indifferent or bad manager to mean that relationships can become toxic in a workplace. The next stressor is role. And I think it'd be familiar to most of us when we start a new job that we actually feel the pressure on us much more acutely, because as yet we don't fully understand what it is our new organization expects us to deliver and how. We don't understand the unwritten social rules. We've not figured out how the workplace works, how to get work done. And where someone's role is ambiguous, this will elevate the level of pressure on somebody. And the final one is change. And very few people actually like change. There are exceptions. If you are the one who's driving the change, or actually you've been very well consulted about change and you feel part of it, then we can mitigate the effects of change. But change imposed on people can be highly stressful. And if we get these out of balance, we land up with someone who is stressed, who is becoming distressed. And I use this little cartoon mainly because it amuses me, but it's not actually what stress looks like. It looks far more like this, because actually someone who is becoming overwhelmed with the pressures of work starts to shut down. Now, if this is a good workplace, there will be support there. There will be good relationships that could contribute to someone getting through this stressful period. But stress relates to mental health and your level of mental health. And if you go back to the mental health pain scale, you'll find that as you start drifting down that scale, you are ever less likely to ask for help. You try and dig yourself out of the hole that you find yourself in that may or may not even be real. It could be pressure you're putting on yourself. So be under no illusion, stress is real and it is debilitating. And what's happening with people at work is if they're under too much pressure, they physically can't deliver. Now, this is the human performance curve. And right down at the bottom, where there's no pressure, we have, well, boredom, because there's no performance, there's no pressure, so there's not a lot to do, so people are bored. This is what's known as the drone zone, and people can brown out. But in the middle, we have this nice wide band that is the comfort zone. We have the skills, the experience, the interest, the creativity to deliver against the level of pressure that's being applied to us. But we don't really learn anything in a comfort zone. We then move up into the dark blue and we get to where we call stretch. This is also the learning zone. This is where we develop. And a good workplace kind of keeps people at that boundary between comfort and stretch. You know, do a little bit extra, learn a bit more, move back into your comfort zone. And that's positive work. That develops people. Over time, the level of performance that they can deliver ever increases. But all it takes is someone to go off ill and you land up having to redistribute some work, or there's suddenly a deadline gets pulled forward. And you try and put your foot down on the accelerator harder and try and work harder. And you land up in strain. And that actually can become quite frightening. This is the point at which people actually can't see the wood for the trees. At the point when they'd normally be delivering really well, they're procrastinating, making lists. They're actually doing a lot of things that perhaps aren't actually going to get themselves out of the problem they're in. Now, if this is a day or two, it's probably not going to cause any long-term harm. But if that carries on, eventually the pressure lands up ramping up because they're not delivering, and their performance crashes. They land up in this panic zone. Ultimately, if we get to the far end of this, we get into burnout. And burnout has the opposite effect of being in that stretch zone. It can permanently reduce our overall performance. And it can take a long time for someone who has started to burn out to get back to even where they were before, let alone start developing. So what might we see from someone who's suffering from stress? Well, there's three main areas: emotional, behavioural, and physical symptoms. The first one is when someone's under a high degree of pressure and they're not coping. It can affect their moods, they can feel nervous, they can be worrying, they might feel helpless, or they might be irritable. But you see things like loss of confidence, people asking for, oh, could you review this? I'm not sure if it's good enough. Perhaps they start talking themselves down, that lack of self-esteem. But you do see things like withdrawal into daydreams and lack of concentration, inability to focus. In terms of behavioural signs and symptoms, you can see why the health and safety executive might be interested in stress, because all the data shows us that you are more error prone when you are under stress. That means you're more likely to have accidents. But other things start happening. It disturbs your sleep, which means you become more fatigued and more stressed. Your work can diminish in quality. If you rely on addictive substances such as nicotine, you probably smoke more. Or if you like the odd drink, maybe you drink more. But you do withdraw from supportive relationships. Perhaps you're not looking after yourself and you're overeating or not eating. But certainly we quite often see this too busy to relax reaction. And in terms of physical signs and symptoms, if you cast your eyes down this list, you'll actually find in there most of the signs and symptoms of a heart attack. Indeed, an acute stress attack can be almost indistinguishable from a heart attack. But we see other things such as skin irritation or rashes. We see people getting more frequent colds, flu, and other infections. And what's happening here is the fight-flight response, which is great if we're faced with a tiger and we need to get out of there quickly, but not good over long periods of time. We're seeing levels of cortisol, of adrenaline raised. We're seeing resources pulled in your body from areas that we might need them, like our digestion system. So that's where indigestion comes in. And over time, your body actually becomes more ill because it's trying to either fight or flee from something that it has no control over. The net result is you land up with a diminished immune system and you become open to many more sources of illness. So some of you may have come across this before. This is the cognitive behavioural model of both mental health and stress. And we start with a situation or trigger. And that will usually trigger off some thoughts. And those thoughts can then influence how we feel, how we behave, and all of that links through to physical symptoms. So every morning, my boss actually walks past my office to get to his office. Now, if I see that he's walking in, I usually wave and say, "Morning." You can see a situation where if he just walked past and didn't say anything, I might think to myself, what have I done? You know, he's in a mood with me. That thought then becomes some feelings. Well, apprehension, hang on a second, I've got a meeting with him in an hour or so that I'm meant to be preparing for. Oh, that's not going to go well, is it? What does that then do to my preparation? Well, my preparation perhaps isn't as good as it might have been. So my behaviors change. I also walk into that meeting on edge, apprehensive, expecting things to go badly. Well, guess what? It's now more likely to go badly. In actual fact, if we go back to the initial thoughts, more accurate would be he's got his headphones on again, or perhaps he's having a bad day. Might not be anything to do with me. What we're doing here is we're trying to mind read and project. We actually can't do that. So when these negative thoughts come in, it's actually a much more positive thing to do and say, is there another explanation for that? And provided we can find other explanations, we usually can, it nips all of this negative cycle in the bud. And that's the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is used to help treat mental ill health. But it's something actually we can learn when we are mentally well, and it helps us bolster our resilience. Now, I've mentioned managers a couple of times, and this is just a quick aside to say that actually the relationship between the manager and employee is actually the single most important contributor to stress at work. And that actually, if that is a good relationship, we can act early and stop an acute stress period becoming ill health. And I would say go and have a look for these HSE line managers competencies. It's the Management Competency Indicator tool. If you want to know how you're managing other people, this is a self-report indicator tool that will tell you how you score against these 4 competencies. And this was a piece of work done with the HSE and the CIPD, the HR professional body. And what it says is that when we are managing people, we should be respectful and responsible. We should actively manage our teams and make sure we're communicating. We should manage the individual. I've already said that stress is a personal thing. We all react slightly differently. Well, as a manager, that means we need to flex our style to manage each and every individual that we're involved with. And we must not shy away from managing difficult situations. And this tool, along with some of the basic videos and tools that the HSE publish, can be used to train our managers on the basis of managing staff without too much in the way of passing stress on to them. So I want to talk finally about personal resilience. So what is personal resilience, and is it common? Well, let's start with this. It is the ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions, misfortune or illness. And it's incredibly common. We all have some degree of resilience, and it's like a muscle. We can actually exercise it and develop it, and we can develop our own resilience and become much stronger in the face of adversity. And it's really about this. I've already demonstrated the power of thinking when I was talking about the cognitive behavioral model. But we've known this for a long time. Epictetus said we are disturbed not by things, but the views that we take of them. I'm not particularly fond of spiders, but there aren't actually any in the UK that are going to harm me. So it's a completely irrational train of thought in my case, even if I have once landed up standing on chairs squealing. And I like this one from Michael de Montaigne. He said that my life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which have never happened. And this is this trying to fortune tell, predict the future, that actually we just can't do. So it's about being more rational in our thinking. So back to this cognitive behavioral model of stress, it's about really challenging those thoughts. Now, how do you cope now in adversity? I don't know, if I've had a bad day, I probably come home, spend a bit of time in the kitchen cooking a good meal, maybe have a glass of wine, shower, early night. That all sounds reasonably positive, but that glass of wine, if that glass of wine becomes a bottle of wine, it becomes every night, that same coping strategy is now a negative. And it's really worth thinking about what you do to cope when things are difficult and if that's actually helping you. Now, This is the model of resilience that I use. There are others, but it's like petals on a flower, and if we want the flower to look beautiful, we have to nurture all of the petals on here. And it starts with perspective. Again, I was talking about the thoughts, and it's about reframing negative experiences. If I've been working on a project and it's not gone well, do I dwell on the fact it's not gone well, or do I engage in lessons learned and after action review and work out what I could do better next time? The latter is actually much more positive and constructive. We need to challenge negative beliefs. You know, we will talk ourselves down an awful lot when actually, if we ask our colleagues, we're probably a lot better than we realize. Now, there are some things in the world we cannot change, and perhaps we need to learn to accept some of them and work on what we can change. And perspective as well, focus on solutions, not the problem. You can ruminate on a problem, and it's like a washing machine mind. It just goes round and round and round. But actually focus on what we need to do to solve the problem. The other thing is, do not dwell on problems, face them. If something's gone wrong at work and it's 3 o'clock on a Friday, I could very easily clock off early and go home. Or I could walk upstairs and tell my boss. The latter is going to have to happen. Going and telling your boss, the latter is going to have to happen at some point anyway. So get it out of the way. Something else that we also need to do is acknowledge what we do well. And I had an excellent boss many years ago, and she actually made me sit down and write a list of the things that I think I do well. Do you know what? That's one of the harder exercises I've ever done, because we don't normally pat ourselves on the back, but how we think drives mood. And she was right. I was going through a bit of a rough patch at the time, and she was able to use my own writing to actually bolster my mood. The next petal on the flower of resilience is about emotional intelligence, and we all have some of this, but it is something we can work on. And it starts with acknowledging our feelings and expressing them appropriately. It's not a bad thing to cry if you're sad, for instance, because you are processing feelings rather than bottling them up and letting them overwhelm you. And actually, overwhelmed for me is an interesting word, because we can be overwhelmed, we can be underwhelmed, but we can't be whelmed, despite the fact that's exactly where we need to be. Also, with emotional intelligence, as well as acknowledging our own feelings and doing something about them, we need to use our skills to support others. Perhaps supporting someone when they've got a little bit of a low mood, challenging them like a previous boss of mine did. And another thing around intelligence is being mindful. Now, you may have heard a lot about mindfulness, but simply just sitting and appreciating where you are. Realizing that actually most of the colleagues you work with, you would do so by choice. You know, where I work at the moment, I work with a lot of talented individuals, and actually just stopping and reflecting on that would be one element of mindfulness. Now, the next petal is about purpose, strengths, and values. This is a little bit more difficult because it's about self-awareness. And do we know what our purpose is at work and outside of work? And does that actually align with what you want it to be? So I ask you a question. If I could magically clear an hour out the day for you, what would you do with it? Now, apart from going and having a quick nap, if you're saying, actually, I'd love to go and do X, maybe go and learn something or read a book, that's something you need to be doing more of. The other thing you need to do is understand your values. What is it that drives you? And does what you do at work and outside of work align with those values? Now, this might be a case of you want to get more involved with certain things at work. You might have strengths that are not being used. You might have ideas as to how they could be used better. You might have things that you'd like to develop. Maybe the idea of public speaking scares you. It certainly used to scare me. So I actually spent time developing that skill. But knowing your strengths, knowing your purpose, and knowing your values, and making sure that your life actually aligns with those will make you far more resilient. And then there's connections. Your support network is vital. And investing time in mutual support pays back in multiples. So help others. Because if nothing else, it makes us feel good. At work, just taking half an hour to help somebody out. But take time with your friends, your family, your colleagues. Nurture your network. Virtually, if you have to. After all, we've all got Zoom or WhatsApp or whatever. We can spend time with people. And then the last one is physical energy. Because if your body hasn't got enough energy, your mind won't either. And stay active. 6,000 steps a day is considered a minimum. Most of us have got mobile phones and we can all get a step counter going on it. 6,000 steps equates to about 3.5 miles a day. And if you're a commuter in London, you're probably doing that already. But doing a bit more physical exercise actually helps our state of mind. It releases dopamine and serotonin. Work. More is not always more. We should all know about the Working Time Directive, or the Working Time Regulations in the UK, which says we shouldn't be working more than 48 hours a week on a 17-week rolling average. It's actually quite a lot of work, and it's interesting as to where that 48 hours comes from. And it comes from the jute mills of Dundee, where an industrialist found that in the 1800s, their workers were doing 12 hours days, 6 days a week. And actually, the quality of the product would drop off towards the end of the day and also drop off towards the end of the week, but seemed to be better on a Monday morning. So they experimented with an 8-hour working day and found that actually productivity went up. And 8 hours a day times 6 days is 48. Now, again, in terms of managing your physical energy, eat well. Comfort food's great when you need a bit of comfort, but it's not great every day. And do take breaks, and that's breaks away from your work. And take time to notice what's around you, and actually what a wonderful world we do live in. Make some me time. Now, that can be challenging, but it can be as simple as listening to some music on your walk to the tube station. And sleep. Do not compromise on sleep. 7.5 to 8 hours a night, every night. If you are not getting that, you are going to massively diminish your physical energy that is available to you. So what now? We've talked about mental health, we've talked about stress, we've talked about resilience. And I'd say it would be good for all of us to just occasionally stop, think, and change. Now, I'm not talking about whole-scale life change, giving up the job and going and living off-grid, although somebody on the call probably might like to do that. I'm talking about one thing. One thing that you could actually change that would improve your current lot in life. Maybe it is putting in your diary that you're actually going to take a lunch break. I did that several years, and I've got to say it's been several years ago, and it's been life-changing for me. I protect my lunchtime. But it's just about leveling up, normalizing that change, and then finding the next thing. So I'm going to leave you with Raj. He's got a last word on his view on pressure.
It's funny, but I've started to realize that some pressure is better than no pressure. And after I graduated, I had a really boring job. It was for a temping agency. They got me in to do office admin, but there just wasn't much to do. I mean, at first, I thought, yeah, great. I get to sit around and I get paid for it. But after a while, it was driving me out of my mind. It was just so boring. Well, my idea of a good day is to come in, put your head down, and then you're completely surprised when it's time for lunch. Now, I work for a big operations center in a bank. And believe me, it can get pretty manic. We have a lot of deadlines, and if you don't get the work done right and on time, well, you can lose the company a lot of money. Oh, it can be really busy sometimes, and we have to work really hard. But, well, there are usually plenty of ups and downs within the pressure itself. I really enjoy the buzz of getting a difficult job done on time, especially when I know my clients are really pleased with what I've done. Yeah, this job's definitely a lot better than when I was temping.
So I will stop the presentation here and open this up to any questions.
We do have some questions, Rosie. First of all, thank you so much for that presentation. I listened to every word and so much of it resonated with me. A couple of things that really resonated was that I was lucky enough to have a boss who always asked if I was okay twice, because the first time you always went, yeah, great, thanks, how are you? And he always went, are you okay, really? And you most oftentimes you weren't. And then the other thing is that, which was the video at the beginning, that we still carry shame about poor mental health.
Very much so.
Even after all this time, and feel the need to hide it. Shocking,
So
really, isn't it?
one of the Scottish mental health charities actually early in the millennium ran a campaign that said ask twice. Because if you ask a British person how they are, they say, yeah, I'm fine, you know, good morning, all of that kind of stuff. And you go, how are you? And then you go.
Absolutely.
And I think it's the most powerful thing you can do.
Absolutely. And when you ask, mean it, when you actually want to know whether somebody is okay or not. Okay, let's move to the questions. So the first one is, how can one know whether stress, anxiety or depression is genetic, and how do you overcome this issue? That's quite a big question.
Oh dear, there is a lot of research into mental health, and there are some very big cohorts, big population studies looking at genetics and mental health, and there is almost certainly some tie, but it's not deterministic, it's probabilistic. It would increase your chances of mental ill health. And what I'll say here is that we don't tend to take our physical health for granted. So why would we take our mental health for granted? Some years ago, I ran a marathon. It took me 9 months to train my body to get to the point where it could run 26.2 miles. It protested the next day somewhat. But a lot of the things that are out there, some of these apps, you know, Headspace, Calm, things like that, a lot of online resources like Mood Gym, which is an excellent website, which is online CBT, can be used to make our mental health stronger. So whether you've got a predisposition or an increased likelihood of having mental health, it doesn't mean you have to suffer with poor mental health.
Great, thank you. We've got some feedback here. Apologies, I had to go, but please thank Rosie. It's been an amazing session. Completely agree with that comment. This one's a long one. I'll try and do it justice. Another well-delivered session from IIRSM. Thanks, Rosie, for managing to condense so many key points into a short session without seeming rushed. I will be taking the quote, overwhelmed or underwhelmed, but we can't be whelmed, which is where we need to be. Of course, with Rosie's permission, fantastic message. Finally, thanks to Rosie, the committee and IIRSM for making my membership worthwhile. Wow, what a compliment. Thank you for that, Richard. Thank you, great. There's some more feedback. Not a question. Stevenson Farmer, cost if converted, we could pay all the NHS firemen and have some funds for a party. That's from Jeff. I'm sure you understand what that means. I don't.
I absolutely do. If we could solve mental health, the economy would be so much richer. What I would say is that there are simple things you can do in your own workplace. One of the things that I actually have just sitting here is my workplace lanyard. We have mental health first responders at work, and we have about half the rate of mental health or mental health related ill health and absence than you would expect for a company of our size, type and age.
That's brilliant. So here's one from Patrick. How do I turn my stress, which has a potential to produce good effects that can result in eustress?
Eustress, yes.
Lots of easy ones for you tonight, Rosie.
Eustress and distress. So distress is when things are too much. Eustress is that state of being in balance with the pressure that you have. And really all I have to say is you have to do something different if you are distressed. I wish I could remember. I think it's Alcoholics Anonymous that says continuing to do the same thing and expecting a different outcome is one form of insanity. If you are currently distressed, something has to change, something has to give. And I think the first thing you have to do is speak with your manager and your organization. And if they're not willing to help you tackle it, you're probably working in the wrong job. I'm gonna be that blunt. It may be a case of taking a look at all the other things you're doing and figuring out what you can dial back on. But fundamentally, if you are currently suffering from stress, you've got to do something about it. But I will say is mild to moderate exercise has been shown to be as effective as antidepressants in tackling mild to moderate stress and mild to moderate depression and anxiety. So I might actually say it's as simple as go for a long walk. It won't do you any harm.
That's what I do at lunchtimes and early in the morning with my dog. It's amazing. You come back feeling completely refreshed. We've got 2 more questions and 1 more comment, and then I think we'll hand back over to Greg for closing comments. So how would, this is a large one as well, how would you handle a boss who knows you're right but unwilling to admit it and always makes it seem like you are not doing your job? I'm sure we've all had a boss like that at some point.
Yeah. Yes, we've all had a boss, and I'm afraid to say my answer to that one is I don't have a good answer to that one. I've had one boss who's definitely like that, and I left. There are just some toxic people in the workplace. What I would say is try not to make yourself too much of a target, and there are some very good books out there like Nasty People by Jay Carter. That will help you really understand their behaviors and perhaps how to counter them. So I'm sorry, I don't have an easy answer as to how to fix a toxic boss.
You're getting all the difficult questions tonight.
Oh,
okay,
absolutely. That's fine.
So we've got one question and then Jeff shared what he does. So there is a resistance from man that mental health is, quote, poppycock. How can we get buy-in from those people?
I think we just need to make them irrelevant by talking about it. Things like that mental health pain scale that I shared, and I will share that with you to put up on the resources page so people can use it. Things like that make it relatable. There are other things out there. Go and Google spoon theory, which is someone talking about how lupus affects their ability to do things, and that they have finite resource. And it's a very good model for the people who aren't affected by chronic illness or mental health problems can relate to. And what we find is that you've got to also keep going at it. So my current company, we trained our first group of mental health first responders about 2.5 years ago. I trained some more the following year and some more this year. This year was notable, though, that I had more volunteers than I had places on the course. It's great. It's gaining momentum in this current, with my current employer. It's gaining traction. People are taking it seriously. And the naysayers, they're being quite quiet lately. And that is a pattern that I have repeated through several places where I've worked. So getting the conversation going and keeping the conversation going is the way to actually silence the naysayers and perhaps even get a few of them on board.
Great advice, thank you. So this is just a bit of feedback from Jeff, what he does. So he feels good. He works in and around London, often takes his camera. I go early, I stop and take images, and this helps me. I use my downtime to download and alter the images through software to create better images. This is one of my releases. What a great release that sounds.
Yeah. And they often say if your job is very cerebral, then maybe you need a hobby that's more physical, and vice versa. But that's not always necessarily the case. And I think actually that's a really good example where that is using perhaps a different skill and a bit of a creative outlet.
Yeah. I used to do jigsaw puzzles during the pandemic when the world went crazy. Me and the cat doing jigsaw puzzles and
Jigsaw puzzles, that's something that actually stresses me out.
Especially if you've lost a piece.
I think I lost a piece years ago, but that's
I know that feeling myself. Right, Greg, I'll hand over to you. I believe you've got a question for Rosie on the pain scale.
Yeah, I did. I think Rosie answered that one. Thank you very much, Julie. That she's going to send some information through on that. That will be brilliant. Recognizing the time, we are almost done. Just like to add my personal thanks, Rosie. That was an excellent session. Loved the Michael de Montaigne quote, which again I think is one that I might use. I also, it's funny enough, I don't know why Julie sprang to mind when you were talking about having a cat close to hand to stroke. But on that note, thank you very much indeed on behalf of the London branch. That was fantastic. And just remains to say thank you all for joining us and attending. And I hope the rest of your day and the rest of your week is suitably whelmed, which I think is no.
That is the new word of the day, it would appear.
Absolutely, absolutely. So,
it even sounds what it means, doesn't it? Whelmed. Yes. Thank you so much, Rosie, for giving up your valuable time, and to you, Greg, and the rest of the London Branch Committee. I'd like to wish everyone a good evening, and we hope to see you at the next London Branch event. Good night, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks all.